Windows, the exemplar of compatibility. Every game is 100% compatible on a Windows handheld, and there's never anything that can go wrong. Except that's definitely not true. In fact, the often touted compatibility of Windows is an illusion brought about by an industry resting on complacency, disposability, and low expectations. So today, we're going to talk about this. Why Windows provides a fundamentally worse experience than something like SteamOS, and how game developers are dropping the ball in this space. One of the most common complaints about the Steam Deck is that it, quote, can't play all my games. And while that's definitely true, it can't play all your games, many attribute the deck's incompatibilities to its custom gaming-focused operating system, SteamOS. To some extent, SteamOS does bear some of the blame, and that's because SteamOS is based on Linux, and some Windows games simply aren't compatible. But is that a red herring? I would argue that it is. In fact, if you were to put Windows 11 on the Steam Deck, you'd find that while you'd have access to a few more contemporary online shooters that require anti-cheat or DRM, you'd actually lose out on many others. See, there's this inaccurate and pernicious idea that Windows is the paragon of compatibility, as if just because you're running Windows 11 on your machine, you can somehow play all of your games. But Windows 11, and heck, even the obsolete Windows 10, have a spurious record when it comes to backwards compatibility. If you just want to play an old game, I mean, something like the big box SimCity 3000, for example, which I find myself wanting to do with alarming frequency, you actually need to jump through numerous hoops to make this game even a remotely playable experience. Now, I can hear you scoff, but I can just get the GOG release and it works just fine. Cool, but I mean, should you have to re-buy your games just to continue playing them? I say no, and that's just a big box release of classic games that I own. How about stuff that's on Steam right now? Star Wars Jedi Knight Mysteries of the Sith, that's a good example. This is a game that I played when I was growing up. It's one of my favorite games ever, and that's not right. And while this is a control issue that could be sorted with some tweaking, there are countless other classics that simply won't work on today's machines using Windows, especially if they're running on a handheld. Now, while you could maintain a collection of period-accurate hardware to feed your retro gaming desires, for most folks that's just out of the question. But who wants to play these old games anyway? Well, look, I've had my Steam account for over a decade. Others have had theirs for over 20 years, and you can't say that Windows can play all your games and then conveniently exclude old games that you don't play. And it's not just 90s games that have problems on modern systems. There are titles from the mid-2000s that have hardware abstraction issues. Many people report issues running games like Command & Conquer Generals, Max Payne 2, and so many more on portrait native displays. So pretty much every PC handheld, including the Steam Deck. Yet on SteamOS, all of these run just fine. And heck, there are games from just the last few years that simply won't run properly on Alder Lake and newer CPUs because of DRM. And then there's Windows itself. God forbid you want to use the perfectly good hardware that you bought 10 plus years ago on Windows, lest you suffer daily inconvenience. I recently tracked down a problem on my system. This USB 3.0 hub that I bought 6 years ago, yeah, despite it being perfectly capable hardware in the year 2023, after the 20H2 build of Windows, this thing became fodder for the waste bin. Yet it works perfectly fine under a Linux environment, but Windows has a fit. What gives? With this device plugged in, Windows will crash to a blue screen of death at least 3 times a week, but I never have kernel panics and I never have issues with this device on Linux. I think I'm painting a pretty clear picture here. Windows is based on the concept of disposability, and as software and hardware progresses, you're just expected to throw out your old stuff and just buy new things, and I just find that contemptible. And I don't think it's more clear than, have you ever wondered why old games keep getting re-releases? I mean, why does BioShock have the remastered edition on Steam? And why is Rockstar only selling the definitive edition demakes of classic GTA games? It's simple, because the original versions of these games have compatibility issues with modern Windows, and these devs don't want to have to support old games that aren't turning a profit. So they make a new version instead and delist the old ones, expecting you to just go along with it. Yet again, a great example of disposability. So why do games, and hardware for that matter, become incompatible anyway? Well, Windows is a proprietary operating system that ships with DLL files. These are essentially libraries of code that other applications rely on to get common things done. Stuff like reading and writing to your file system, communicating with the Windows kernel, generating pseudo-random numbers, accessing your network, DirectX, and many, many other things. Now, these DLL files, along with the Windows kernel, provide what I'll call, for the sake of this video, the Windows environment. A software layer that sits between your x86-based hardware and the applications you want to use. Now, games become incompatible as new versions of Windows get released and the Windows environment changes. So applications may be built for the Windows 98 environment, or the XP environment, or the Windows 7 environment. And back then, even with Windows 7, these were pretty stable targets, infrequently receiving updates with breaking changes. But as high-speed broadband internet has taken hold, Microsoft has moved towards a AAA publisher's mentality, the ship it now, fix it later approach. So the new releases of Windows remove old or outdated code, substitute unfashionable systems for shiny new ones, ship updates and improvements among other things, and as Microsoft's priorities in the Windows space change, older software and hardware just breaks. So the answer is things change. That's why an entry-level machine you bought back in 2015 can't seem to keep up with the latest build of Windows 10. But that's okay, right? I mean, can't you just do a little research online and find some community-made guide or an unofficial patch or a fan-made engine rebuild? Yes, you absolutely can. But then you're getting into some dangerous territory. See, if you're the kind of person who has the know-how to wrestle with your games and suplex them into a playable state, then it really doesn't matter what platform you're on or what operating system you're running. The only difference at that point is your experience. Now, if you're only familiar with the Windows way of doing things, having to trick your OS into behaving in a way that isn't power user approved, then being a Linux newbie can be an alienating experience. Not being able to get a simple task done quickly enough, I get it, it's frustrating, and honestly, that's really the crux of this whole issue. Because while the compatibility issues between Linux and Windows are certainly different, Windows is not the paragon it is made out to be. It really is that the majority of people know how to use Windows and they don't know how to use Linux. But the fact of the matter is, since the release of Windows Vista, backwards compatibility has really suffered, and software written for older versions of Windows have not fared well. So while SteamOS might be missing the usual spate of modern online shooters, Windows is missing so many more of the classics, especially on handhelds. Unless you're willing to fork over your hard-earned cash for inferior remakes or to do the legwork yourself, you're going to have a bad time trying to play classic games on Windows. Proton, on the other hand, is quite mature and capable of running most software written for Windows, especially older games. And compatibility with Proton is actually up to the developers of a game rather than Valve. Sure, it's not 100% accurate, and it doesn't provide every possible DLL that ships with the Windows environment, but it's pretty close. And the older versions of Windows environments are actually very well represented here with Proton. In fact, unless the developer takes proactive measures to make a game incompatible with Proton, things usually just work. And if things don't just work out of the box with new games, Valve comes along pretty quickly and fixes it. Truth be told, Proton has better compatibility with older software than Windows does at this point, and as D8VK continues to mature, we'll see the expansive catalog of 90s games and early 2000s software finding even greater compatibility. The fact is, there's an illusion, a pernicious lie out there. Windows gets all this praise for its compatibility, but that's for no other reason than it's the default. You buy a new PC and chances are very high that it ships with Redmond's OS. And it's been that way for over 30 years. So of course, if a manufacturer ships a Windows PC, they're going to be selecting parts that are compatible with Windows. And of course, if a vendor wants their parts to be bought by manufacturers, they'll write drivers for Windows. And of course, if a game developer wants to sell as many copies as possible, they're going to target Windows. But if you take a look at the Steam Deck, even today, Windows support is pretty mid. Granted, Valve has released a few hardware drivers for Windows here and there, but I mean, it took them almost a year for the audio drivers to actually support the use of built-in speakers. And what we see with Windows on the Steam Deck is the OS without the makeup. We see the plain Jane OS where the manufacturer hasn't triaged Windows into a stable, usable state. The same holds true for game developers. They target Windows not because it's the best, but because it's the default, and you can't give Windows the credit for being the most compatible any more than you can give the moon credit for its brightness. Here's the thing, with the Steam Deck, the Mirage was broken. The magic trick was explained. Windows is not the default because it's earned its place at the top. In fact, it's been kind of a yoke on progress. Windows has been living rent-free in the minds of PC gamers, despite the fact that it's an unemployed couch surfer who has overstayed its welcome. And it's time we kicked the bum out of the house. And in this metaphor, the house is your PC. But I'd like to know what you think. Has Windows overstayed its welcome in the desktop space? Leave me a comment and let me know. Now, I want to extend a special thank you to Matt Dancer for his continued top-tier support of this show. It's because of folks like Matt that I'm able to continue making videos just like this and keeping these lights on. If you believe in the work that I'm doing here and you want to help this show grow, you can use the link to Patreon below and pledge your support. And thanks. That's going to do it for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.